welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share encounters people had with crawlers. These stories include a young man who had multiple crawler encounters before going outside one night to be met with a terrifying scream, a young man and his friends seeing a bizarre creature while on an overnight tour of an abandoned sanatorium, and 2 crawler encounters from Indiana. But first, we start with a woman who shares what her granddaughter saw in her front yard one night. Before we get started, I just want to say that a lot of people turn to posting their stories online because they feel like they can't tell anyone and would be seen as crazy if they did. Most people who experience these beings are traumatized and feel the need to unburden themselves or just have someone who will believe them listen to their story. If you've had an encounter and you feel like you can't tell anyone for fear of being made fun of, ridiculed, called a liar, or any other reason, email me. You'll find a sympathetic ear here who will believe you. I do want to mention that just because you email me your story, it doesn't mean it will end up in an episode on my channel. Your story can stay between me and you if that's what you want. Also, if you've had an encounter and would like to come on in an episode and tell your story, email me. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Mississippi, where one woman shared a story about her granddaughter seeing something terrifying in the front yard while looking for her cat. The encounter took place about 5 or 6 months before she took to the online community to share it. They live in Northeast Mississippi in a rural area. The original poster's granddaughter stepped outside to look for her cat when she stumbled upon a horrifying sight in the front yard. She describes the creature as an elderly, hairless man with shiny skin moving on all 4s. When he noticed her, he dropped down on all 4s and scurried toward the barn. At just 11 years old, the sight terrified her so much that she ended up sleeping with her grandmother and grandfather for an entire week. Despite having blinds on her windows, she insisted that her grandmother nailed towels over each one to block any chance of it peering into her room. One commenter said he saw something similar in central Mississippi. It was gray and running on 2 legs. To this, the grandmother replied that the one her granddaughter saw was on 4 legs, then stood up onto 2 before dropping back down onto 4 to run away. Ever since the granddaughter's encounter, they've avoided going outside at night unless they're in well-lit areas, and they've installed additional outdoor lights around the house. At the time of her posting the story, they haven't encountered that thing again. When asked by a commenter, she told them they installed about 10 outdoor lights around their home, and now she hardly ventures outside after sunset. And she never anticipated having an experience like that right on her own land. Even though they live in a rural area, there are quite a few houses along their street. In fact, she says there are 10 homes within a mile and a half of hers, so they're not isolated. There would be nothing more traumatizing for a child than seeing an actual monster in the flesh while outside alone at night. I don't blame her for wanting to sleep with her grandparents for a week, then wanting towels nailed over her windows after that. I'm just glad this thing ran when it spotted her and they haven't seen it since then. I'm also glad she wanted the towels covering her windows because these things are notorious for looking in windows at night, and she was traumatized enough by seeing this thing in the yard. There's no telling how bad it would have been if she saw it looking in her window, especially after just gathering the courage to sleep in her own room again, where she is supposed to feel safe and secure. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you walked outside and saw a creature like that in your yard? The next story comes from a poster who's had the misfortune of encountering a crawler multiple times. But the story he shares here is one that involves mimicry, and he turned to the online community for answers about what kinds of sounds crawlers make. He does wonder if he could have heard a normal animal or a person, but given his past with encountering these beings, he thinks it might have been a crawler. He doesn't say where he lives, just that his house is across the street from a forest. The night of his encounter, he stepped outside to search for his keys, which he had forgotten while working in the yard. Almost instantly, a wave of dread washed over him, as if he was being watched. He quickly retreated indoors, and one of his family members joined him to help with the search. Just a couple of minutes after they ventured back outside, they were startled by a strange noise that seemed to, quote, yell at them, prompting them both to hurry back inside. This all unfolded in about 20 minutes before he posted his story online at approximately 1 a.m., and he's unsure how to describe the sound this thing made. It wasn't quite a full scream, but it was very close, and within 40 feet of them, he says. He describes the noise as resembling a human yell, but having a raspy, almost animalistic quality to it. He ends by saying he knows he doesn't give much detail, but asks for any insights into what they might have encountered that night. One commenter told him it's tough to give a definitive answer, but if he spotted crawlers in the vicinity, there's a decent chance it could have been one. He goes on to say that he once encountered a crawler that mimicked his voice. It matched his tone, volume, and pitch, yet it had a mechanical quality to it that made it feel off. It's difficult for him to try to describe, but the creature couldn't quite replicate his exact voice. The original poster responded by saying that's what he was thinking, especially since he's heard other similar stories describing the same thing. However, since he didn't actually see it this time, he hesitated to make any assumptions about what could have made the noise. In his previous encounters, he never heard them make any noises or vocalizations of any kind. I thought this would be a good story to include in a crawler episode because they are said to be mimics, like many other types of cryptids. Now I know he didn't see anything the night he heard the noise, which gives room for it being just about anything, but the fact that he described it as sounding almost human, yet raspy and having an animalistic quality to it, coupled with the fact that he had the feeling of dread wash over him and the sensation of being watched, it makes me think that it could have been a cryptid. What also caught my attention was the commenter describing what he heard coming from a crawler as sounding mechanical. When cryptids mimic, the sound they make or phrases and/or words they speak are almost always described as sounding mechanical, as if it was a sound clip played on repeat, the same exact way, tone, and tempo every time. This is what the mimicked voice or sound is described as sounding like in almost every single story I've heard involving mimicry. In any case, I'm glad that's all that happened and they were able to get out of there. What do you think about this story? And what do you think they heard that night? A crawler? Another type of cryptid? Just a normal animal? Or something else entirely? The next story comes from a poster who saw something bizarre while staying overnight at the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium is located in Louisville, Kentucky, and was constructed in the early 1900s, opening in 1910. It was built to house between 40 to 50 tuberculosis patients due to an outbreak in Jefferson County at the time. It was expanded in 1912 and again in 1914 to raise the capacity to 130 patients, including 50 beds for children. The final expansion took place in 1924, adding a 5-story building that could hold an additional 400 patients. The hospital closed in 1961 due to it no longer being needed, and at one point there were plans to turn it into a hotel, but those plans fell through. There were also plans to turn it into a minimum security prison in 1983, but those plans fell through as well due to the protests of people living nearby. In 2001, the facility was turned into a haunted house attraction each Halloween, with the proceeds going toward its restoration. It is now a site for tours, which includes overnight stays, and that's where our next story comes in. The original poster's encounter while on an overnight tour took place 7 or 8 years before he posted it online. The night mostly went off without a hitch, but as dawn approached while he and his friends were in surgery on the 4th or 5th floor, he glanced out the window and spotted what he initially thought was an injured dog. However, it seemed larger, making him think it might have been a wounded deer. It was moving in a peculiar way, almost like a crab, and something about it felt off. After a moment, whatever this thing was emerged from the shadows and he got a clearer view of it. It appeared to be a very tall, slender humanoid walking on all fours in a way he describes as a backward crab walk. His face was tilted upward as if it was staring directly at him. He couldn't discern any of this thing's distinct features, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Then, in an instant, it darted back into the darkness. The whole encounter was so quick that he barely had time to react, but when he turned around, he found one of his friends standing behind him. His friend had also witnessed the same strange creature. Both of them were left in shock and chose not to mention it to anyone at first, but later he asked the tour guide if there had been any reports of unusual sightings on the grounds. The tour guide told him, quote, "People see things crawling around down there all the time." He ends by saying he wishes there was more to tell, but he is glad there isn't. One thing I noticed about this story that made me want to share and talk about it was the fact that the original poster wasn't the only one who saw this thing. His friends saw it too, and not only that, but the tour guide backed up their sighting. I mention this because so many times when I come across stories, people share them online because no one ever believes them. They need a place to tell it to get it off their chest and have someone believe them while not making fun of them or looking at them and treating them like they're crazy. I wouldn't wish an encounter on anyone, as they can be very traumatic, but if someone were to have an encounter with one of these beings, I would hope that they weren't alone so they could have someone there to not only back them up, but for them to have someone to talk to about what they saw. And not only that, but to have the tour guide reassure them by telling them people see things crawling around there all the time. In many cases, people often question their own sanity when seeing a creature like this, not being able to tell anyone. I can believe that both young men were in shock seeing something like that. I would be too. I'm just glad they were up high when they saw this thing and nothing else came of it. The grounds of an old abandoned hospital would be the perfect spot for a cryptid to hang around. I would also say to go unnoticed, but with them offering overnight tours of the facility and the guide mentioning people seeing something crawling around there quite often, that's out of the question. What do you think of this story? Would you go to an overnight tour of a place like this, even after hearing the story and knowing people see something crawling around there quite often? The final story of this episode comes to us from Indiana, where one poster had an encounter with what they believe was a crawler in Daviess County during winter. This is followed up by a commenter who also shared their encounter in Indiana with a similar creature. Daviess County is located in southwest Indiana. It was around 8 p.m. on the night of the encounter, and darkness had already enveloped everything outside. The original poster was out tending to his goats, with his shed standing approximately 300 yards from his house. To reach it, he had to cross 2 small fields and navigate a narrow path through the woods. These woods bordered a naval facility in Indiana. After finishing tending to the goats, he started his return journey home. He crossed one field and was halfway through the narrow path when he began hearing rustling in the underbrush nearby. Armed with only a small flashlight that illuminated about 10 feet ahead, he pressed on. Just as he neared the end of the path, he caught sight of a creature. It was on all fours, with a gaunt frame, long limbs, and pale skin. He says that while his description of this thing might sound typical, it had an exceptionally long and flexible neck. Just as he spotted whatever this thing was, it noticed him too and darted down the path, skittering into the second field. This field had a small hill at its center and the creature vanished over it. After witnessing this, he took off sprinting around the opposite side of the hill and made his way back to his home, where he quickly locked all the doors. He says the creature was terrifying, but it almost felt more like it was observant rather than aggressive, at least in that moment. One commenter backed up the original poster by relaying his own encounter with a creature he says looked exactly like what the OP described. His encounter happened in Madison County, Indiana, where he worked third shift in a jail. One night, as he left work on a refreshing, cool fall evening, he decided to take an alternate route back home. There were several four-way stops along this road, and as he approached one such intersection, he began to slow down by a sizable patch of woods, which he says is pretty typical in that area. But as he neared the stop sign, he noticed a pale, emaciated creature. He was instantly hit with intense chills as his eyes began watering and a sense of dread settled over him. He quickly shifted into second gear and floored it, ignoring the rest of the stop signs on his way home. He ends by saying he's glad he found the forum where he shared his encounter because it had been weighing on him for months. Just as I mentioned in the last story, when people see creatures like this, it can be very traumatic, and if they have to carry that alone, it begins to become a heavy burden. It seems like the man in the second encounter was carrying that burden and was just glad to have a platform to get his story out there to people who would not only listen, but believe him. I see this all the time when scouring the internet for stories, with people wanting someone to just listen to their story. They usually don't feel like they can tell anyone and have to endure what they went through alone. I'm just glad he found that site so he could unburden himself. I also can't blame him for getting out there like he did and ignoring the stop signs on the rest of his trip home. I'm sure many of us would do the exact same thing. Another thing I want to mention about his encounters are the intense chills and his eyes beginning to water, as well as the sense of dread settling over him. This happens in so many encounters I read and hear. As for the first encounter, I hear a lot of stories about crawlers where they give off an evil feeling and feel threatening. But then there are stories like this one where the original poster said it felt more like it was observing him rather than anything else before it ran away. From everything I've gathered in my research, these things are evil, even though others would disagree, and it could be that this thing was just stalking its prey. But on the other hand, it could have just been curious with him, being that it probably doesn't get a close-up look at humans very often, if at all. The same thing can be said for Sasquatches, who sometimes seem to be more curious with people than anything else. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is always the case, or even the case here, and you should never let your guard down around these creatures for any reason. I believe they have ill intent. Another thing I want to mention is that the creature he described here is similar to that of a Wendigo, and his encounter did take place during the winter. However, Wendigos are said to be very malicious and evil, and I don't think he would have made it out of there if this thing was a Wendigo hunting him, nor would it have run away the way it did. It's a good thing that this creature did take off running and the OP was able to make his way home without further incident. I just hope that this thing leaves the area and nothing else happens with the original poster or with his goats. What do you think about these encounters? What would you do if you were walking in the woods and you saw something like that? Or if you were driving at night and saw a crawler on the side of the road? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.